Welcome to Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions, the channel dedicated to lost stories of the biblical past. Discover stories of pre-Christian historical roots, biblical legends, lost church history and forgotten historical characters of faith. It is very helpful if you hit the like, subscribe and share. Help build my channel and let's take a look together into these uncovered forgotten tales. Imagine being executed for your religious beliefs by the most powerful empire on earth. Now imagine that instead of being extinguished, your faith not only survives but merges with another persecuted religion to create one of the most powerful spiritual forces in history. Today on Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions, we explore the extraordinary, controversial, and largely forgotten connection between the Druids of ancient Britain and Gaul with the first Christian missionaries, a tale of persecution, prophecy, and an improbable alliance that would ultimately reshape the Western world. When Roman legions first landed on British shores in 55 BCE, they encountered something that terrified them far more than British warriors. They met the Druids. These weren't the romanticized figures of modern fantasy with flowing white robes and magical powers. They were the intellectual, spiritual, and political backbone of Celtic society. And contrary to what Roman propaganda would have you believe, they weren't bloodthirsty barbarians sacrificing humans on stone altars. They were sophisticated theologians with a faith that, in the words of historian David Hume, swayed the minds of men like no other religion. What follows is the story of how this ancient British faith created the perfect spiritual foundation for the arrival of Christianity, and how both religions, persecuted by Rome, would find in each other not just allies, but kindred spirits. Our story begins not in the misty groves of Britain, but in the bustling Mediterranean port of Marseille in southern France. In the 1st century CE, Marseille was France's oldest seaport, a vibrant multicultural hub where Gallic natives mingled with Phoenician merchants and Greek colonists. It was the gateway between the Mediterranean world and northwest Europe, particularly Britain, with its valuable tin and lead exports. In future videos I will give a full picture on how the Greeks and Phoenicians were connected to the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Among the familiar merchant vessels docking at Marseille were ships belonging to a wealthy Judean businessman, Joseph of Arimathea. The same Joseph who, according to Christian tradition, provided his own tomb for the burial of Jesus of Nazareth. Few realize that before becoming one of Christianity's most important early figures, Joseph was a metals merchant with established business connections throughout the Roman world, including significant tin mining interests in Cornwall and Devon. These pre-existing commercial networks would prove crucial in Christianity's westward expansion. As Roman persecution of the followers of the Way, as early Christianity was known, intensified in Judea, Joseph's maritime connections offered an escape route for early believers, including members of Jesus' inner circle. But why would persecuted Judean Christians find sanctuary specifically in Gaul and Britain? The answer lies in one of history's most intriguing religious parallels. The Druids of Britain and Gaul weren't simply pagan nature worshippers, as popular imagination often portrays them. Archaeological evidence from Sir Flinders Petrie's excavations at Stonehenge revealed only fossilized bones of sheep and goats beneath the ancient altar, evidence of sacrificial practices remarkably similar to those of the ancient Hebrews, not the human sacrifices described in Roman accounts. The truth, deliberately obscured by Roman propaganda, was that Druidic theology shared striking similarities with Judaic beliefs. They adhered to a belief in the immortality of the soul and the omniscience of one God. Most remarkably, they anticipated the coming of a Messiah and understood the concept of vicarious atonement, the idea that one could die for the sins of many. Some scholars even suggest the word Druid derives not from the Celtic Drius, meaning oak, but from Druthan, meaning servant of truth. Their official motto was, in fact, the truth against the world. Their teachings, codified in collections known as the Triads, aligned significantly with what they called the Old Hebrew faith. When Julius Caesar launched what he called a punitive expedition against Britain in 55 BCE, it wasn't merely territorial expansion that motivated Rome. It was the Druids' persistent support of the Gaulish brethren against Roman rule and the threat their influential religious system posed to Roman authority. Caesar's initial campaign, despite later propaganda, ended in what his political rivals called a dismal failure. His forces were routed within 2 weeks and retreated back to Gaul. For the next decade, Rome's mightiest armed forces, led by its ablest generals, struggled to penetrate more than a few miles inland against British resistance led by the famed Pendragon Caswallaun. It wasn't until 120 CE under Emperor Hadrian that Britain was incorporated into Roman domains, and importantly, this occurred through treaty, not conquest. The British retained their kings, lands, indigenous laws, and rights, with only a Roman military nucleus established for the realm's defence. This remarkable arrangement speaks to the strength and organisation of British society under Druidic influence. While Britain maintained its relative independence, Gaul's lack of natural defences made it more vulnerable to Roman control. Yet even under Roman rule, Gaul's religious spirit was diminished but never extinguished. The region of Provence-Viennoise became particularly significant as a refuge for early Christians fleeing persecution. When Joseph of Arimathea arrived in Marseille around 35-36 CE, accompanied by the Bethany family, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and other early converts, they encountered a population with a deep receptivity for their message. The mutual persecution experiences under Roman rule created a natural bond between Gallic believers and these Judean refugees. Philip, one of Jesus' disciples, had arrived at Marseille ahead of Joseph, establishing an early missionary base. Together with Joseph, they coordinated a network that would eventually spread Christianity throughout southern Gaul. Though this evangelizing work would continue for centuries until disrupted by later invasions of Franks, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals, the foundation of the church was firmly established through what historians describe as carefully formed plans by these early missionaries. But the most extraordinary chapter of this story unfolds in Britain, where Joseph's long-established commercial connections gave him unique access. His ships had kept the British up to date with world happenings, including the crucifixion of Jesus, which became a cause of grave concern to the Druidic Church. Recognizing this event as the fulfillment of prophecy, Druidic delegates swiftly journeyed to Gaul to obtain first-hand information from Joseph. What happened next defies conventional historical narratives about religious conversion. There was no argument, civil or religious, and no bloodshed in Britain's transition from Druidism to Christianity. Instead, Joseph was openly accepted and formally elected as head of the Christ-converted British Church. The Druidic name gradually gave way to the term Culdees, a term the British themselves created to identify the accepted Christ faith, which had previously been known simply as the Way. The remarkable theological compatibility between Druidism and early Christianity raises profound questions. How could a faith developed in isolation on the western edge of Europe share so much with Judaic tradition? Some scholars point to ancient connections between the Mediterranean and British Isles that predate written history. Others suggest a common origin for both religious traditions. When Roman emperors, Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, and later Diocletian, issued decrees making both Druidic and Christian faiths capital offenses punishable by death, they inadvertently strengthened the bond between these already aligned spiritual traditions. Britain's unique status as the only free country in the world at that time made it an invaluable sanctuary for apostolic leaders fleeing Roman persecution. The path to establishing Christianity in the Western world came at an almost unimaginable cost. Millions were affected by what historical records describe as unbelievable tragedy, wholesale massacre, fiendish torture, brutalities of the Colosseum, horrors of the fetid prison of the Mamertine, and dreadful scourging wars. The British contribution to early Christianity is characterized as the most colossal sacrifice in blood and life known to history. Yet throughout these dark times, the religious spirit of Britain and Gaul remained indomitable. The British religious identity in particular is described as flaming like a volcano in its evangelistic zeal and bursting forth fiercely when faced with foreign interference. The arrival of Joseph of Arimathea and other early Christians in Britain and Gaul represents what many historians view as an epochal drama that transformed history, changed imperial destiny, and led peoples of the world to a better way of life. The miraculous safe arrival was interpreted as the will of God working out his inscrutable purpose and the fulfillment of the prophetic words of Jesus to come to the lost sheep of Israel. This peaceful merging of Druidic and Christian traditions set in motion the organization of the Christian clan and the marshalling of their forces into determined action that would ultimately lead to Christianity becoming the dominant religion of the Western world, not through conquest, but through a remarkable spiritual compatibility that transcended cultural differences. The story of the Druids and early Christianity challenges us to reconsider conventional narratives about religious conversion in the ancient world. It reveals how shared theological foundations can bridge seemingly disparate cultures. It reminds us that history is rarely as simple as conquerors and conquered, but often involves complex networks of trade, ideas, and shared human experiences. Most importantly, it offers a counter-narrative to the view that religious change necessarily involves conflict and bloodshed. Here was a transition marked not by warfare but by recognition, the recognition by an ancient British priesthood that their centuries-old prophecies had been fulfilled in a Jewish teacher executed thousands of miles away. In our modern world, where religious differences so often drive conflict, perhaps there's something profound to learn from this forgotten chapter of history, when two persecuted faiths found in each other not enemies, but the fulfillment of the deepest spiritual aspirations. What if everything you thought you knew about the birth of Christianity was incomplete? What if the most pivotal moment in early Christian history didn't happen in Jerusalem, Rome, or even Constantinople, but on a misty island at the edge of the known world? Today, we're diving into one of history's most extraordinary untold stories, the secret mission that allegedly brought Christianity to Britain decades before it reached most of the Roman Empire, led by a wealthy merchant who had cradled the broken body of Jesus Christ himself. This is the story of Joseph of Arimathea, the man who begged Pontius Pilate for Jesus' body, and his legendary journey to what ancient texts called the Sacred Isles of the West. But this wasn't a journey he made alone, and it wasn't a decision he made lightly. It began with a clandestine gathering in the bustling port city of Marseille, where scattered followers of the Way emerged from hiding to reunite under the protection of one of the most fearless leaders the early church had ever known. Picture Marseille in the 1st century, a cosmopolitan hub where merchants, philosophers, and refugees from across the Mediterranean converged. Among the usual chaos of commerce and trade, something extraordinary was happening. In hidden corners and private homes, long-separated followers of Jesus were finding each other again, drawn together by whispered messages and coded signs that only they would understand. At the center of this reunion stood Joseph of Arimathea, a man whose very presence commanded respect. This wasn't simply because of his wealth, though his successful business enterprises had certainly earned him influence throughout the region. Rather, it was his unique combination of analytical brilliance and unflinching courage that had made him invaluable during the most dangerous early years of Christianity. While other disciples had scattered when persecution intensified, Joseph had remained, operating as what some described as the power behind the throne, providing crucial guidance and protection when the movement was at its most vulnerable. Those gathering in Marseille had witnessed horrors that would haunt them forever. Roman persecution had reached levels of brutality that contemporaries compared to the worst atrocities in human history. Followers of Jesus were being crucified, burned alive, and fed to wild animals for the entertainment of crowds. Yet here they were, these survivors, drawn together once again by something stronger than fear, an unshakable conviction that their mission was far from over. Among all the remarkable figures who had gathered in Marseille, one stood apart with unique authority: Philip, one of Jesus' original 12 apostles. His presence transformed what might have been simply a reunion into something far more significant, a formal commissioning ceremony that would echo through the centuries. Philip's credentials were unquestionable. He was not only one of the 12, but substantial testimony confirmed his commission to evangelize Gaul. More importantly, he possessed something that no one else in that gathering could claim: the apostolic authority to consecrate others for sacred missions. And it was this authority that he was preparing to use in a ceremony that would forever change the trajectory of Christianity in the Western world. The consecration of Joseph of Arimathea has been misunderstood by many historians, who incorrectly interpreted it as Joseph's conversion to Christianity. But the biblical record makes clear that Joseph was already a disciple of Jesus long before this moment. The Jerusalem apostles had acknowledged him as Christ's follower during Jesus' final days. What was happening in Marseille was something far more significant than conversion: it was ordination. According to ancient church tradition, proper apostolic ordination required the laying on of hands by one of the original apostles. This wasn't merely ceremonial, it was understood to be the transmission of divine authority from those who had walked directly with Jesus to those who would carry his message to the ends of the earth. And remarkably, this wouldn't be the only time Philip would consecrate Joseph. Historical records suggest he performed this sacred ritual 3 times over a span of 30 years, with the final ceremony in 65 AD being particularly significant for reasons that would soon become clear. To understand the full significance of Joseph's consecration, we need to grasp the scope of Philip's own extraordinary ministry. Far from being a local religious leader, Philip had established himself as the acknowledged apostle of Gaul, the accepted head of the Gallic Christian Church. But his influence extended far beyond even this impressive regional authority. Historical records reveal a man constantly in motion, traveling throughout the known world with his fellow apostles. The great Spanish churchman Isidore of Seville, writing in the early 7th century, described Philip as preaching to Gauls and barbarous neighboring nations, bringing light to those in darkness near the ocean. Cardinal Baronius's ecclesiastical annals speak of Philip adorning Upper Asia with the gospel, and travelling through parts of Scythia, preaching alongside the apostle Bartholomew. This wasn't the ministry of a man content to establish a single church and settle down. Philip was a pioneer, pushing the boundaries of the known world to plant the seeds of Christianity. Philip's eventual martyrdom at the age of 87 in Hierapolis, Phrygia, where he was stoned and crucified alongside his daughters, would come much later. But his vision for spreading Christianity to the uttermost parts of the earth was already fully formed when he laid hands on Joseph of Arimathea and commissioned him for what may have been the most ambitious missionary journey of the apostolic age. What happened next sounds like something from legend, but multiple historical sources confirm its basic outline. A delegation of British Druidic bishops had somehow learned of the gathering in Marseille and had travelled across the Channel specifically to extend an invitation to Joseph. But this wasn't a casual invitation to visit, it was an urgent plea for Joseph to return to Britain and teach Christ's gospel among the Celtic peoples. The political dimensions of this invitation were equally remarkable. Prince Arviragus, described as a noble leader of the Silures in Cornwall, had sent his own emissaries to enlarge the invitation. They offered not just a welcome, but lands, safe haven, and protection under Roman authority. This wasn't some random prince making a desperate political calculation. Arviragus was the son of King Cunobelinus, the historical figure who inspired Shakespeare's Cymbeline, and cousin to the renowned warrior-patriot Caradoc, known to the Romans as Caractacus. We're talking about the most powerful warrior kingdom in Britain, the royal Silurian dynasty from which the later English Tudor kings and queens would claim descent. When they extended this invitation to Joseph, they were offering him the protection and resources of what was effectively a sovereign nation. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this invitation was that it wasn't entirely unexpected. Joseph and Arviragus apparently knew each other already. Joseph's business enterprises had included mining operations in Cornwall and Devon, making him well known among both common folk and aristocracy throughout the region. For Jesus's great-uncle, as tradition holds Joseph to have been, this represented something more than a missionary opportunity. It was a homecoming. The tradition of Jesus's connection to Britain adds another layer of profound significance to Joseph's mission. According to ancient accounts preserved in multiple sources, Jesus himself had visited these islands, not as an adult teacher, but as a boy accompanying his great-uncle Joseph on business trips. Traditions from Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Wiltshire, and Wales speak of the young Jesus walking these landscapes, absorbing their ancient wisdom and perhaps laying the spiritual groundwork for what was to come. More remarkably, some traditions suggest that after leaving India in his adult years, Jesus had journeyed to Britain during his silent ministry years and established a retreat there. At this sacred site, he allegedly built a simple wattle altar to God's glory, a humble structure that would become the focal point of one of Christianity's most significant foundations. The connections to India in these accounts are particularly fascinating. Ancient Indian texts, including the Vishnu Purana, mention Jesus dwelling among Indian wise men and visiting the Himalayan kingdom of Nepal. These same Indian religious teachers, according to tradition, were familiar with the British Isles and described them in their ancient books as the Sacred Isles of the West and Britashton, the seat of religious learning. When Joseph arrived in Britain with his 12 companions, his first destination was not a major population centre or royal court, but that simple wattle altar that Jesus had allegedly constructed years earlier. According to St. Augustine, writing much later to the Pope, this altar was still standing when Joseph arrived, a humble structure that had somehow survived the decades and was waiting to become the foundation of something unprecedented. Here, at this sacred site, Joseph of Arimathea built what many historians consider to be the first above-ground Christian church in the world. This wasn't a grand cathedral or imposing basilica, but a simple structure dedicated to God's glory in Jesus' name and to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Yet its significance was immeasurable. It represented the first permanent Christian sanctuary in a land that would eventually become known as the Sacred Isle. What Joseph and his companions accomplished in Britain reverberates through history in ways that are still being discovered. Within a remarkably short time, Britain had gained a reputation as the most hallowed ground on earth, commonly spoken of as the Sacred Isle, and recognized as the motherland of Christianity. This wasn't mere local pride or religious hyperbole, it was a recognition that something unprecedented had taken root in these misty islands. The Druidic priesthood, rather than resisting this new faith, provided what witnesses described as sympathetic ears to the gospel message. The shared trauma of persecution had created a bond between these refugees from Roman brutality and the Celtic spiritual leaders who understood the cost of maintaining faith under oppression. What emerged was not the destruction of one religious tradition by another, but a unique synthesis that would influence Christian expression for centuries to come. The story of Joseph of Arimathea's mission to Britain challenges our understanding of how Christianity spread in its earliest years. Far from being a purely Mediterranean phenomenon that gradually expanded northward, it suggests a much more dynamic and far-reaching apostolic strategy, one that recognized no geographical boundaries and was willing to plant the seeds of faith in the most remote corners of the known world. In the year 36 AD, a weathered ship cut through treacherous waters off the British coast. On board was Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy merchant who had provided his own tomb for Jesus Christ's burial. But this journey would make history in ways no one could have imagined. Joseph was about to establish Christianity in Britain decades before Rome even embraced the faith, launching a story that would challenge royal authority for nearly 2 millennia. Joseph's expedition had spent years in Gaul with the Apostle Philip, but Britain called with an irresistible pull. The missionary assembled a core group including the Bethany disciples, those who had known Jesus personally. Most remarkably, they allied with British Druids who would guide them safely to their destination. As their vessel navigated the dangerous Severn Sea, the group spotted their landmark, a towering green hill resembling Mount Tabor from their homeland. This was Glastonbury Tor, the divine beacon. Following the Brew and Parrot rivers 12 miles inland, they reached something extraordinary, a cluster of mystical islands rising from the marshland. Their destination was the Sacred Isle of Avalon, completely surrounded by vast apple orchards. To the Celts, this was profoundly significant. Avalon meant apple in their language, and the fruit symbolized divine blessing and fertility in their ancient traditions. What happened next defied all expectations. Waiting on Avalon's shores was an astonishing welcoming committee. King Guiderius, supreme monarch of Britain, alongside his brother Prince Arviragus of the royal Silures tribe. Most remarkably, British Druidic priests stood with them, indigenous spiritual leaders embracing these foreign missionaries rather than viewing them as threats. Prince Arviragus made an unprecedented offer. He granted Joseph 12 hides of prime land, 1,920 acres, completely tax-free, forever. This became the first charter in recorded history dedicated specifically in the name of Jesus Christ, creating the hallowed acres of Christendom. The significance of this moment echoed through history. When William the Conqueror invaded over 1,000 years later, he recognized the charter's validity and recorded it in the Domesday Book. The legal precedent would prove crucial centuries later when British monarchs needed to assert their independence from papal authority. Exhausted from his journey, Joseph climbed a nearby hill to rest. In what seemed like an unconscious gesture, he thrust his walking staff into the ground and left it there. What happened next defied natural explanation. The staff took root and began growing into a living tree. But this wasn't ordinary growth. The Holy Thorn developed characteristics found nowhere else on Earth. It bloomed twice yearly, once at Christmas and once in May, creating a natural calendar honoring Christ's birth and spring's renewal. This phenomenon has continued for nearly 2,000 years. When Puritan extremists destroyed the original tree during Cromwell's reign in the 1640s, previously planted cuttings survived with identical miraculous properties. Today, visitors to Glastonbury still witness this wonder in St. John's Churchyard, where snow-white petals bloom gloriously at appointed seasons, serving as what believers call a beacon proclaiming God's continued reign. The legal implications of Joseph's charter became a cornerstone of British constitutional law. When Queen Elizabeth I faced coordinated attacks from France, Spain, and Rome in 1570, with Pope Pius V attempting to subject Britain to Roman Catholic authority, she appealed to these ancient documents. In a famous throne speech, Elizabeth declared that as Prince Arviragus's lineal descendant, she had hereditary right to reject papal supremacy. Britain's Christian authority, she proclaimed, predated Roman Catholicism itself, tracing back to direct apostolic appointment. This wasn't mere political posturing, it was constitutional law based on documented royal grants. Every British monarch since Elizabeth I has taken coronation oaths as defender of the faith, acknowledging only Christ as church head. As recently as 1953, when Roman Catholic leaders petitioned Queen Elizabeth II to remit this oath, the British government firmly refused, declaring the kingdom remained defender of the true Christian cause with Christ at its head. The most extraordinary claims about Glastonbury concern the biblical figures who allegedly gathered there. Historical accounts suggest Mary, mother of Jesus, walked these grounds alongside Mary Magdalene, first witness to the resurrection. The beloved Bethany sisters, Martha and Mary, reportedly joined the community, as did Mary Cleopas and Mary Salome, mother of apostles James and John. Peter, the church's rock, allegedly ministered here with Paul, apostle to the Gentiles. Philip, who commissioned Joseph's mission, was said to have visited, along with James, Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead, and revolutionary apostle Simon Zelotes. Most remarkably, tradition asserts Jesus Christ himself visited this location, personally constructing a simple wattle chapel and using this sacred space for prayer and divine communion. Physical proof of these claims remains visible today. Embedded in abbey walls is an ancient, weather-worn stone bearing two sacred names, Jesus and Maria, believed carved by the saints themselves. This mysterious artifact has generated centuries of scholarly debate and continues to mystify visitors. The ruins of what historians call the Mother Church of Christendom stand where Joseph allegedly built his first crude altar. This simple wattle and thatch structure, dedicated to God's glory and honoring the Blessed Mary, was reportedly the first Christian church ever erected above ground. For over a millennium, Glastonbury became Christianity's most important pilgrimage destination. Believers from across the known world journeyed here to make vows, undergo conversion, and receive confirmation. Many trained here before departing as missionaries to Earth's far corners, often facing gruesome martyrdom for their faith. The site's significance was so profound that mighty kings chose burial, with the elect in Christ, within God's acre. The ancient cemetery became a repository of dramatic history unmatched by any burial ground worldwide. Glastonbury's physical landscape tells its own transformation story. Originally, these were actual islands surrounded by water and marshland. During the Saxon period, monastic communities undertook massive drainage projects, transforming mystical isles into today's dry plains. Nearby stood Inishwaitran, or Glass Island, which archaeologists believe was a major centre of ancient British glass production. Saxons adapted this industrial heritage into Glastonbury, preserving memory of the sophisticated Celtic civilization that welcomed Joseph's mission. Prince Arviragus' commitment extended beyond land grants. In 43 AD, just 7 years after Joseph's arrival, Arviragus led armies against Roman persecution under the title Defender of the Faith. His grandson, King Lucius, renewed and expanded the original charter in 156 AD after his baptism at Winchester, proclaiming himself Defender of the Faith, before Roman Catholicism even existed. This royal protection established a pattern of monarchical support for British Christianity that continues today. The constitutional framework created by Joseph's mission provided legal foundation for challenging foreign religious authority whenever British sovereignty was threatened. Today's Glastonbury visitors experience what many describe as inexplicable enchantment. Standing amid noble abbey ruins, surrounded by verdant meadows comprising part of the original 1,920 dedicated acres, people report profound connection to nearly 2 millennia of Christian history. The Jesus Maria stone continues puzzling scholars. The Holy Thorn maintains its unique blooming cycle, and constitutional principles established by Joseph's charter remain embedded in British law. Whether viewed as literal history or powerful tradition, these accounts' impact on British culture and constitutional development is undeniable. Joseph of Arimathea's mission to Glastonbury represents far more than early British Christianity. It's a tale weaving together royal politics, miraculous phenomena, constitutional law, and international diplomacy in ways still influencing British society. What if everything we thought we knew about the spread of early Christianity was wrong? What if a single word, one geographic reference buried in ancient texts, could completely transform our understanding of how the Christian faith reached Western Europe? Today's story begins with a question that has puzzled scholars for centuries. When the Apostle Paul wrote his famous letter to the Galatians, was he writing to Celtic tribes in modern-day Turkey, or was he actually addressing the people of ancient France? It sounds like a simple geographic mix-up, but the implications are staggering. This isn't just about correcting an old map, it's about discovering that Christianity may have reached the heart of Europe centuries earlier than anyone imagined, carried there by the apostles themselves in a coordinated mission. The controversy centers around one of Paul's most important letters, his epistle to the Galatians. For generations, biblical scholars have assumed Paul was writing to Celtic tribes who had migrated to Asia Minor, in what we now call Turkey. These people were known as Galatians, and they had indeed settled there after a great Celtic migration in the 3rd century BC. It turns out that some of Christianity's most respected early authorities had a completely different understanding of this letter. And their interpretation opens up a historical rabbit hole that leads all the way to ancient France, Britain, and a massive apostolic mission that most people have never heard of. Enter Cardinal Baronius, a 16th-century Vatican librarian and church historian whose credentials were impeccable. This wasn't some fringe theologian with wild theories. Baronius was the leading Catholic historian of his era, with access to documents and martyrologies that most scholars could only dream of seeing. After years of systematic examination of ancient sources, Baronius made a startling recommendation: the Roman martyrology should be corrected to read Gauls instead of Galatians. But Baronius wasn't alone in this interpretation. Going back even further, we find Saint Epiphanius of Salamis, a 4th-century bishop who lived much closer to the apostolic period. Epiphanius had something modern scholars lack. He was fluent in Greek, Hebrew, Syriac, and Latin, and he had access to traditions that were still relatively fresh. According to Epiphanius, when Paul mentioned that Crescens is in Gaul, this wasn't a confusion of geographic terms, it was exactly what the Eastern Church understood it to mean. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Both the Galatians of Asia Minor and the Gauls of ancient France were Celtic peoples. They shared the same ethnic heritage, the same tribal structures, and even similar names. But this wasn't just scholarly confusion. According to Perry Longueval, a researcher who studied Eastern Church traditions extensively, there was actually widespread agreement across Eastern Christianity that when Paul wrote about Galatia, he was referring to Gaul. Even when ancient manuscripts read Galatia, the understanding was still Gaul. This wasn't a mistake, it was a consistent interpretive tradition that stretched across the Eastern Church. Modern scholarship began to take notice when Reverend Lionel Smithard Lewis, a Master of Arts and Vicar of Glastonbury, started connecting the dots. Lewis wasn't just any parish priest, he was recognized as the foremost church historian of his generation, with a particular expertise in early British and continental Christian connections. His location in Glastonbury was significant too, as this ancient town sits at the heart of some of Britain's earliest Christian traditions. The story becomes even more compelling when we examine the historical details of Paul's later ministry. Around 63 AD, late in Paul's career, after his Roman imprisonment, historical evidence suggests he embarked on a mission that would take him far beyond the familiar territories of the Eastern Mediterranean. The route was straightforward: the Aurelian Way, a major Roman road that connected Rome to Arles in southern France. This wasn't some treacherous wilderness journey, it was a well-maintained highway with regular stops, supplies, and accommodations. For an experienced traveler like Paul, it would have been as routine as a modern interstate journey, just longer. Paul didn't travel alone. According to historical reconstruction by researcher Edouard de Bazilaire, Paul's team included Saint Luke, who had just completed his masterwork, the Acts of the Apostles, bringing both his skills as a historian and his medical expertise to the mission. There was also Trophimus, who would be strategically placed in Arles, a major commercial and administrative center that served as a gateway between Italy and the interior of Gaul. And Crescens, who would penetrate even deeper into Gallic territory, establishing a Christian presence in Vienne. The genius of this strategy becomes clear when you consider the logistics. Arles wasn't chosen randomly, it was a Roman colonial hub, a major trading center with diverse populations, and perfectly positioned for further expansion into interior Gaul. Vienne, Crescens's destination, was an important administrative center that would provide access to the broader Gallic territories. This wasn't haphazard evangelism, it was strategic church planting. But the Gallic mission was just one part of a much larger picture. Historical documents, including the Recognitions of Clement, a 2nd-century text that provides a window into apostolic period activities, describe what can only be called Christianity's first strategic planning conference. The location was Caesarea, a major Roman port and provincial capital that served as the perfect launching point for Mediterranean missions. The attendees read like a who's who of early Christianity: Saint Peter, the acknowledged leader among the apostles; Saint Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy council member who had provided Christ's tomb and had extensive commercial connections; Lazarus, whose personal experience of resurrection provided unparalleled evangelistic credentials; and various holy women who had been integral to Jesus' ministry. The mission that launched from Caesarea landed at Marseille, another strategically chosen location. As a major Roman port and commercial center, Marseille provided immediate access to both the Mediterranean world and the interior of Gaul via the Rhône River system. From there, the expansion followed a systematic pattern. Missionaries moved up the Rhône Valley, establishing Christian communities in strategic locations, training local leadership, and creating self-sustaining churches. The persistence of local traditions along this route is remarkable. From Marseille to Morlaix on the northern coast of Brittany, communities have maintained consistent memories of these early apostolic visits across nearly 2 millennia. But the strategy didn't stop at the French coast. The same commercial networks that had brought tin from Britain to the Mediterranean, networks that Joseph of Arimathea knew intimately from his business dealings, became highways for the gospel. The connection between Morlaix and Cornwall was well established, and the short channel crossing was routine for merchants. For centuries, these accounts were relegated to the realm of pious legend. But scholarly opinion began to shift when historians like Archbishop James Ussher started applying rigorous analytical methods to the evidence. Ussher wasn't just any scholar, he was one of the most respected chronologists and textual analysts of his era, fluent in multiple ancient languages and with access to manuscripts that most scholars never saw. Ussher's critique of contemporary scholarship was devastating. He accused modern historians of systematic methodological failures, neglecting primary sources, failing to cross-reference historical records, relying on modern assumptions rather than ancient evidence, and fundamentally misunderstanding ancient geographic references. The result, according to Ussher, was a massive distortion of early Christian history. When multiple independent traditions converge, Eastern church testimony, Western ecclesiastical records, secular historical sources, and archaeological evidence, the cumulative case becomes compelling. We're not talking about a single questionable source, but about consistent testimony across different regions, cultures, and centuries. If this interpretation is correct, the implications are staggering. Western European Christianity wouldn't be a medieval development or even a late Roman phenomenon, it would be an apostolic foundation, established by the original apostles themselves in the 1st century. The scope of apostolic Christianity would be far broader than commonly assumed, extending from Palestine to Britain in a coordinated, systematic effort. The biblical implications are equally significant. If Paul's letter to the Galatians was indeed addressed to the Gauls of France rather than the Galatians of Asia Minor, it changes our understanding not just of that letter, but of the entire scope of apostolic ministry. When Paul mentions Crescens being in Gaul, it's not a geographic confusion, it's an accurate description of coordinated apostolic deployment. Pope Zosimus's 5th century declaration recognizing Trophimus as the apostolic founder of Arles takes on new significance. This wasn't medieval legend-making, it was official ecclesiastical recognition of historical fact, based on traditions that were still relatively fresh. The question of whether Paul wrote to Galatians or Gauls might seem like ancient academic hair-splitting, but it opens a window into a completely different understanding of early Christian history. Instead of a faith that slowly spread westward over centuries, we see coordinated apostolic missions reaching the Atlantic coast in the 1st century. Instead of primitive, unorganized evangelism, we see sophisticated strategic planning that utilized the best available infrastructure and resources. The cumulative evidence, linguistic, historical, ecclesiastical, and archaeological, suggests that Christianity reached Western Europe not through gradual cultural diffusion, but through systematic apostolic mission. The implications extend far beyond academic history into fundamental questions about the nature, scope, and timing of Christianity's global expansion. If you would like more information where to research this subject, check out my other videos and pause this image and look into these resources. I hope you enjoyed this forgotten biblical story. Leave a like, comment, share and subscribe. This is very helpful. Join me next time for another lost story of our biblical history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.